Good afternoon. Welcome to the Fellows Symposium, which is always one of the high points of the year. And I'm very much looking forward to what I know will be wonderful presentations today of the Earth Institute Fellows. I'd like to remind us all that the Fellows program, which began back in 2003, I believe. So we're entering our 13th year now, has had as its flagship from the start sustainable development. And so we have wanted fellows to come who work across the natural and the policy disciplines, or the natural and the human disciplines, and we've had a most remarkable flow of talent over the years, and it's an extraordinary institution. In 2016, I think it's right to say that the world is catching up with the Earth Institute in that the world has adopted sustainable development as the centerpiece of global cooperation in two very formal ways last fall. On September 25th, of course, the UN member states unanimously adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are 17 goals that will define the terms of sustainable development for global diplomacy and cooperation for the years 2016 to 2030. And then on December 12, the world adopted the Paris Agreement on climate change, which is the first universal agreement on climate change since the signing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change way back in 1992. This is very important. I think it's right to say that agreements by themselves don't prove anything, but without such agreements, it's almost impossible to proceed. And the fact that we had two unanimous agreements around sustainable development is a sign of the seriousness with which these issues are taken. When I look at the wonderful topics that we're going to hear today, they really fit, not to pigeonhole you, but they do fit in the global agenda. You will be helping to inform the global agenda in a very central way. Shauna Down's work on nutritional impacts of irrigated horticulture, which we'll start with, is squarely SDG 2 on sustainable agriculture. Robert Elliott's work on next generation green infrastructure is specifically SDG 9 on sustainable infrastructure. Xiaohui Fang's work on growth strategies and community dynamics of tropical trees is SDG 15, which is sustainable terrestrial ecosystems. Victoria Lee's work on nighttime thermal satisfaction and cooling strategies in New York City is centrally around SDG 11, which is sustainable cities and how to organize cities in a more sustainable way. Justin Mankin's work on the human impacts of climate change in the context of climate uncertainty is squarely both the Paris Climate Agreement and also SDG 13. And Jeffrey Paller's work on accountability in unexpected places, democratic practices in African slums is about good governance, SDG 16. In other words, the UN member states tried to create a holistic framework. And I think given how hard it is to negotiate with 193 countries, they actually did a pretty workmanlike job. And the work that is underway with the Earth Institute Fellows is really vital for solutions for very complex challenges. So I want to express my excitement for today and my gratitude to the Fellows, to John Mutter for his wonderful leadership of this program from the very start. And I want to call Shauna Downs to speak to us about the nutritional impacts of irrigated horticulture in the Sahel, leveraging a randomized control trial in Senegal. Thank you, Shauna.
So I'm going to talk about the project that I've probably spent the most time since I began my fellowship here on. Unfortunately, I still don't have data on this project, so I won't be really talking about what we found, but more about the study design and what we're planning to do. And this project is a collaboration between Jessica Afonso at Johns Hopkins University and Ram Fishman at George Washington University, who was one of Jeff's PhD students, I believe. So I just thought I'd start off by just briefly talking about the Senegalese context, both in terms of agriculture and nutrition. So the three regions that we're working in, which is Thiès, Diourbel, and Fatick, it's mostly arid. So most farmers are only growing crops in the dry season, or in the rainy season. And most of those crops are cowpea, millet, and groundnut. So it's all in the groundnut belt. So there's a little bit of horticulture production that's happening, but it's not, in most villages, people aren't producing horticulture, mostly because they don't have access to water. And at the same time, from a nutrition perspective, there's very high rates of stunting, and particularly when children stop being exclusively breastfed. So up until 6 months, the stunting rates aren't actually that high, but once you start introducing complementary foods to the diet, stunting rates seem to increase quite dramatically sometimes. And that's mainly because the foods that are being introduced into the diet tend to be grains, cereals, and not nutrient dense. So they're not really feeding very many vegetables or meat, which is very high in iron and zinc. So because of this, there's very high rates of anemia, and that's actually our primary outcome of this study, is looking at anemia rates. So this is a large development project. It's being implemented by the Israeli government, so Mashav, but it's actually a joint project through the Senegalese government and the Italian cooperation. So the Italians are paying for the study, or paying for the development project, and the Israelis are the ones that are implementing. So because we have these three governments working together, that has definitely caused some challenges in terms of implementation and some delays to the project. But still, it's really nice to be able to do an impact evaluation of an actual development project, especially in terms of scale up. So the intent of the study is to expand drip irrigation to 62 villages in those three regions, so Thiès, Diourbel, and Fatick. And it's mainly women's farming groups that will get the drip irrigation. So they basically have a perimeter, a closed-off perimeter, and then the tubes, the drip irrigation tubes, are set up within the perimeter, and then each woman, or some of the farmers' groups are mixed, so in some cases it will be men, will get one plot where they can grow their own produce. And so in addition to receiving the drip irrigation, they also get some extension, so some advice on how to produce these crops, and then some seeds. And this is only for the first year, though. So after that, they're meant to be able to use the income that they make from this to buy the seeds themselves. So this is actually just a picture from the model drip irrigation site in Toubatoul in Thiès. And so as I mentioned, so the farmers are all in the same perimeter, but they each have their own plot. And so they can decide, in some cases they can decide what they want to produce, and in other cases the group as a whole makes the decision on what they're producing. So in this case they just started planting okra. So you can just barely see the beginning of that. It's a cluster randomized control trial, and we have 62 villages in the experimental group and 62 villages in the control. And it's kind of a 2-by-2 design. So in the experimental group, we have the agricultural intervention, which is the drip irrigation plus extension, seeds, and a bit of other things. But then on top of that, we have nutrition education. So both the control and the treatment group are getting nutrition education. And then we're delivering that through two different means. So one is through kind of a traditional interpersonal communication through community health workers, and the second is through voice messaging. And I think we originally thought we were going to do text messaging, but then realized that wasn't very relevant to the context because the majority of people can't read, so that obviously will not work. So we've now switched it to voice messaging. And we also had originally planned to follow up. So we have 1,240 women and young children, and we hope to follow them from baseline to follow-up. But now there's been some delays in the implementation of the project, and because in terms of nutrition indicators, a lot of them are for children under 5, our children will actually age out of that under 5 age group. So we're actually going to have to do 2 panels, one at baseline and one at follow-up. So it's not the ideal way of doing things, but unfortunately, sometimes we can't control the timelines of development projects. So this project is unique, I think, for 2 reasons. One, it's injecting nutrition into an existing agriculture development project. And I think as nutritionists, we talk a lot about this and how we need nutrition-sensitive agriculture, but there aren't so many cases of actually injecting it into an existing development project. So that's really exciting for us. And then also, we're given the opportunity to use voice messaging and to see whether or not this will have an impact on nutrition outcomes. Because obviously for scale up, this could actually be quite easy if, to send messages rather than interpersonal communication. So this is by no means for you to be able to read, but it's just to give you a sense of the different pathways that we're looking at. So we're not just looking at agriculture and nutrition. We're looking at how, when you produce something, when you're producing vegetables, through which pathways could it potentially improve nutrition outcomes? So is it through an income pathway? So do people have more money and then they're purchasing more nutrient-dense foods, for example, meat? Or do they spend less time in the fields? Because drip irrigation, there's not a lot of manual labor involved, or it's a lot less than if you have watering cans. So are those women then able to spend more time caring for their children, and that leads to improved infant young child feeding practices and care practices. So we're looking at all these potential pathways that could be improved through this project. In terms of timelines, we've done some piloting. So we did piloting of the questionnaires in June and July, and then also focus groups with both groups of women and groups of men. And that was to help plan the nutrition education component. So we wanted to get a sense of what people are feeding their children now, because really, from conception to 2 years of age is really the most important age group in terms of improving nutrition and preventing stunting. So we wanted to get a sense of what people are feeding their children now, so that we can potentially target some of the practices that are maybe not optimal. And then we are currently in the field doing baseline surveys. So I spent most of January and the beginning of February in Senegal trying to roll out baseline. And then in terms of implementation of the intervention, this is very optimistic. When we were there, when I was in Senegal to roll out the baseline data collection, we kind of found out from our partners there that implementation probably won't start until the end of the year. So there's going to be some delays in terms of implementation. But once the irrigation is implemented, then we are going to follow up after 2 years and then after 3 years as well. In terms of what data we're collecting data on demographics, household composition, agriculture. We have a very long section on agriculture, assets, income, food security, and nutrition. And in terms of nutrition, we're looking at dietary diversity. And in addition to that, we're doing hemoglobin measurements in both women and children. So this is a picture actually of one of the children that's getting their hemoglobin levels checked, and it's just a little finger prick, so it's very easy in the field. You get the results right away. We're also doing village questionnaire just to get a sense of the infrastructure in the village, and for example, things like access to roads, access to health centers, and that type of thing. And then also a farmers group questionnaire just to get a sense of the dynamics of the farmer groups. Because with the drip irrigation, after about 5 years, you actually have to replace the tubes. So these groups really need to work together, and they need to work together well and start saving money from the beginning so that if something goes wrong, they can pay to replace it. And so we really want to look at the dynamics of the groups. And then in addition to that, we're doing a market survey that's looking at what foods are available and the prices of those foods. And this is mainly to inform the nutrition education component, because we want to know, we don't want to just tell women that they should be feeding their child something that's not actually in the market and that isn't affordable. So in terms of key outcomes, obviously agricultural productivity, income, labor, and time use, women's empowerment, food security, dietary diversity, food expenditure, infant young child feeding practices, and then anemia. And so the way that the questionnaire works is we begin with the household head, and they answer all the questions about the household, about agriculture, about assets and income, and then all the nutrition questions are for the woman who has a young child. So I just thought I would put this up because I think that there are a lot of challenges with doing RCTs, particularly in a developing world context, and particularly when you're trying to evaluate the impact of a development project. And I just thought it was worth noting just because I think there's a push to do RCTs, which I think is really important, but at the same time we just have to recognize that there are challenges when you decide to do that kind of study design. So for us, one of the main challenges is definitely the timelines of the implementers. And obviously we can't control this, so that is sometimes causes a bit of frustration, but still, at the end of the day, it's very exciting to be able to be doing this impact evaluation. But obviously, it's definitely leading to delays for us. And it's really difficult from a nutrition perspective because most of the indicators are for children under 5. So in terms of trying to be able to follow the same child over time, it just becomes a bit difficult. There's also, for this project, a lack of clarity in terms of who will actually be the beneficiaries of the project. Because within a given farmers group, it's not 100% certain that the people that we have selected, randomly selected, will get a plot within this perimeter. Because in some cases, the farmers group is very large, so it can be upwards of 200 people, and there's not enough land in the perimeter for each household to get a plot. So that's definitely a challenge. And then just to note, coming more from a medical background, that real life is not a laboratory, and it's a lot different, obviously, when you're trying to do any of these in the field. But it's definitely an excellent learning experience. So I just will finish up very quickly with some acknowledgements. So I just wanted to acknowledge my co-investigators, so Jessica Fonzo, Ram Fishman, and then 2 PhD students at George Washington University, Josefina Kalaj and Vida Bobek. And then also my mentors here, Jessica Fonzo, who's now at Johns Hopkins, Richard Deckelbaum, and Glenn Denning. Thank you.
Thank you. You didn't explain what the interventions are.
Okay, so the intervention for, oh, sorry. So the question was, I didn't explain what the intervention was exactly. So in terms of the nutrition education intervention, we're currently developing it, but it's mainly going to be on infant young child feeding practices, and really trying to get families that are producing these new crops to incorporate them into their own diets rather than just selling them. So that's one component, but also
only to the treatment side.
No, to both the control. Well, yeah, so that part of it, yeah. So it's very difficult. Yeah, so that is something that we have been thinking a lot about, because that is one of the things we want to do, is to try and get people to be consuming for own consumption the produce that they're producing. But obviously, yeah, in the control group they won't get that. So that was one component of the intervention.
Well, what is your decision about that?
Well, that's why I'm saying we haven't actually. We're just in the stages of trying to plan the nutrition education component right now. So those are definitely things that we have to consider, and it's tough because on one hand, it's nice to be able to give the control group nutrition education, but yeah, it has to be the same in both groups. So how we kind of incorporate that component into it, I'm not entirely sure. And then in terms of the irrigation component of the intervention, that as well is not, it's Meshav is the one that's leading that. So they're getting drip irrigation. So each farmers group will get the drip irrigation, and then they will get extension, but what that looks like, we're not entirely sure about right now. And then even in terms of seeds, it's all a bit unclear at the moment. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons that we really need to have a good process evaluation alongside the intervention to kind of see really what was delivered. Because we don't have, we have control over the nutrition education component, but we don't have control really over the agriculture intervention. Mm-hmm. But we will do our best to try and track how that actually is implemented.
The agriculture intervention by itself, though, is not a nutrition intervention. In other words, Mashav is not guiding the farmers, therefore plant particular crops. But can you do that, or is that part of? That's something we've been discussing with Mashav to see whether or not we can try and influence which crops they're producing. But I'm not sure, because, for example, in the model site, they grew onions, which from a nutrition perspective is not the most nutrient dense. Right. So we're trying to see how we're able to kind of influence that, knowing that we're really not the people that are in charge. So it's a bit tricky, and even politically it's a bit tricky, this project in general. But yeah, that's definitely something that we're trying to do. Okay, great, thank you. Other hands? I think there was another question. We'll take all questions for you. Because I got this roll.
Thank you for the presentation. Are these drips computer-driven, and what controls the drips? Because in some applications of drip irrigation, it's computer-driven, and somebody needs to understand the software. What controls it, and how do the farmers themselves interface with the control of the irrigation?
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question. This is not computerized, so there's a tap that they can open up the tap and they can change the frequency of the drip. And it depends on which crop they're producing. So for example, for onions, you need a certain amount of water, so you have the drip set on a specific setting. And the farmers, they have, so at least in the model site, so I'm not entirely sure if this is how it's going to happen for all the 62 sites, but in the model site, they have a technician that helps that farmers group to explain how to use the drip properly. It's like having basically a person there a lot of the time, I won't say all the time, but a lot of the time, providing extension services. But I'm not sure in terms of scaling it up to the 62 villages if they're going to do the exact same thing.
Thank you for that. I have one short question, one longer one. First is, do you allow the farmers to seed save, or are they expected or required to purchase seeds with their income? And the second is, I'm an ethnographer, and I was struck by the decision to interview women and men separately, and specifically to interview women only about what's happening in the home, whereas everywhere I've been in Africa, women are the farmers. So you may be targeting the wrong group, and I'm not entirely convinced that a voicemail message as opposed to an interactive engagement is going to be effective, again, based on my experience, not in Senegal, but in many other parts of Africa.
Yeah, I think I'll just start maybe with the last question. Yeah, I think that's what we'll see. Personally, it's true that interpersonal communication, especially in a place like West Africa, is likely to work better. It might be more expensive, but it probably works better, and I think that's what we will find in the study. I don't think that we think that the voice messaging is going to be as effective, but we'll be able to tell that, which will be helpful. Because I think there is this push to try and do more text messaging and voice messaging, so it'd be nice to know whether or not that is effective or not. In terms of seed saving, so my understanding from what I've been told by farmers is that for horticulture products, it's not as useful to save the seeds. So they normally buy seeds, and they're improved seeds normally for horticulture products. And I think for the first campaign at the model site, they were given the seeds. They didn't have to pay for them. But then after that, at least based on the model site, they will have to start paying for them themselves. Anything else? All right, thank you.